Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, but more specifically, we're going to be discussing the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I've wanted to make this video for a very, very long time. And I sit here today with the ETH Bitcoin valuation coming in at approximately 0.038 to 0.039. You can see that if you go to shorter time frames, it's basically just been bouncing around between those levels, right? Here's 0.0383 all the way back up to a little bit like 0.0393. So that's where the ETH Bitcoin valuation sits today. And I think back, right, to how many years it has taken for the ETH Bitcoin valuation to get to these levels, and how I always thought that it would, but that it was such a long journey, and it made a lot of people think that I was sort of against Ethereum because I thought that it was going to go to 0.03 to 0.04. Many people falsely accused me of calling for the death of Ethereum, even though I was clear that was not the case. And I think the reality is that the people that accuse me of that, in my opinion, are too naive to even imagine a world where ETH Bitcoin goes to 0.03 to 0.04 and it doesn't die, right? It doesn't. In fact, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin dropped all the way down to 0.01 to 0.02 and it still didn't die, right? So I think it, and the cycle before that, it dropped to 0.007. So it's important to have some perspective on things, right? And what's absolutely fascinating to me is that a lot of the people who gave me such a hard time about it for the last several years are now dunking on Ethereum, right? They're tossing the ball up, or they're having some people toss the ball up, and then they're dunking on ETH and saying, that it's just going to always go down against Bitcoin. And the problem that I have is that what a lot of people do is they only want to reflect what the overall masses think, right? So for instance, if people are generally bullish on ETH Bitcoin, they will only post bullish things. But then when the overall masses turn bearish on it, then they want to become bearish on it because they want to be accepted by the people that follow them, right? And so you always have to be willing to tell the people that listen to you and that follow you things that they don't want to hear, or things that they might not agree with and they probably don't agree with. But that's the reason why the markets are so difficult. Oftentimes the markets go in the opposite direction as to what the masses think, right? And so after all these years, ETH Bitcoin is finally below 0.04. And so what I'd like to do in this video is talk about what the outlook is, right? I want to be clear. I want to be crystal clear so that there's no, ambiguity later on. I think that relative to Bitcoin, below 0.04 is a fairly attractive valuation. I cannot know where the bottom is. I can't. What we're going to do in this video, though, we're going to talk about some ideas of where it theoretically could be, both in terms of valuation and in terms of time. But there's a secret when it comes to investing. There's not a single person here that can time tops and bottoms exactly. It's possible that you get lucky here or there, but it's going to be impossible to time it perfectly. My timing on ETH Bitcoin was to convert back here, here, and then again up here. So I essentially talked about making 3 conversions, one at 0.075, one down here in the 0.06s, I believe, and then one back up here around 0.08 or so, right around the time of the merge, right? And so if you take, say, the average of that, right? The average, let's say the average is somewhere over here, this has captured the bulk of the move, right? I mean, it's, from that level, it's arguably down about 50%. And the whole point of the entire trade was to essentially double my ETH, right? To double up the ETH that I had going through a very low risk strategy. And the reason I want to paint, and maybe it's a little bit more clear after all these years, basically the idea was I don't know what Bitcoin USD is going to do, but I'm fairly confident that ETH is going to underperform Bitcoin. So what I'm going to do, this is what I did back then, right, is I'm just going to put my ETH into Bitcoin and then ride that. Now, in the short term, when I made that trade from ETH to Bitcoin in May of 2022, Bitcoin actually went down on its USD pair. But again, you fast forward so many years and no one cares about that anymore, right? Essentially, what has happened is by making the trade here, right, by making the trade at 0.075, which is when I first became vocally bearish on ETH Bitcoin right here, I've been able to double my ETH just simply by sitting in Bitcoin. I didn't have to predict what the market was going to do on its USD pair. All I had to know was that rate hiking cycle, quantitative tightening, Bitcoin's going to outperform Ethereum. So for me, it's a relatively low risk trade. It was a relatively low risk trade to make. And in the short term, I felt like a genius because it went down. In the medium term, I felt like a moron because then it went back up. And then it just slowly came back down. So the market teaches us many, many valuable lessons. But I just want to talk about how below 0.04 is the area where I think ETH Bitcoin will, in fact, carve out a bottom. Okay, below 0.04, which is where it is right now. I don't know how low it's going to go. I wish I could tell you. I wish I could come up here, with a bold voice and say, this is exactly what's going to happen and you can take it to the bank. But the truth is I can't and I don't know. What I'm going to show you is where it could bottom in terms of valuation and in terms of time. Okay? So, one of the things I have mentioned before is the 2016 and 2019 fractals, right? And if you look at either of these fractals, it would suggest that the bottom for ETH Bitcoin is going to happen relatively soon. Why do I say that? Well, let's take a look. So if you go look at 2016, and by the way, if you're not familiar with these fractals, just to get you sort of on board and acknowledge kind of like how it has been similar, if you look, there's a peak and then there's a double top, but there's a lower high, but between that lower high, there is a range low that is set, right? And you can see it's happened here again, right? But between these peaks, there is a range low that is set. And then ETH Bitcoin fades back to that low, consolidates above it for a while, and then eventually it breaks support, right? Eventually it breaks support, and it's done the same exact thing this time. Now, to me, this has often looked like a combination of 2016 and 2019. It's not exactly 2016. It's not exactly 2019. It looks like 2016 in the sense that there was a fake out in the middle of the year, just like there was this year, right? And then it went down and bottomed out. But it looks like 2019 in the sense that it broke down durably in July, which is exactly when it broke down in 2019, right around the time or right before rate cuts arrived. Right? So when I look at this, it is very familiar, right? It feels like 2016 in some ways, but it also feels like 2019. Now I think, like, guys, it's not 2016, it's not 2019. Hell, it's 2024. So it's going to be a little bit different. But in terms of time, right? In terms of time, when ETH Bitcoin broke the range low on a weekly close below the range low. So this was the low. You could argue it was here. It took about 7 weeks for ETH Bitcoin to bottom. That was in 2016. Now, if you look at 2019, after it broke the range low, it took about 8 weeks to bottom, right? So you have 7 weeks and then you have 8 weeks. So how long has it been? Well, this was the range low. It looks like it broke below it the week of July 22nd. So it's already been 8 weeks, right? It's been 8 weeks already. And so in terms of time, it would be dangerous to assume that it's going to go a lot lower. It could go a little lower, but it would be dangerous to assume it's going to go a lot lower in terms of time. Now, when does it actually bottom? It could be this week. It could be next week. I don't really know. But my guess is that it's going to happen sometime soon. Sometime soon. And you're kidding yourself if you think you're going to be able to time it. Because I feel like I can't time it. And I feel like I'm one of the few people. I get a lot of things wrong. A lot. I mean, if I listed everything I've gotten wrong over the last few years, this would be a 10-hour video, right? So take it from me in the sense that this is one of the things I actually got right. I'm telling you, I don't know exactly where it's going to bottom, but as I have said for years, I do believe, and I stand by, I do think the bottom is between 0.03 and 0.04, right? That's where I think the bottom is, but I don't know exactly where. You could make a case that it already has, right? It's been about 8 weeks, it's been about 2 months, and it's gone to the target range, right? I mean, with a clear conscience, I can't just sit here and remain bearish on ETH Bitcoin forever. Now, there are some things that make me somewhat puzzled, and I'll just be honest, right? There are some things that have me somewhat puzzled, and one of those is the fact that alt Bitcoin pairs haven't really followed course yet. The other thing to remember is that, and this kind of keeps me on my toes as well, is that last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed when the Fed pivoted from QT to QE. The problem is the Fed just released a statement here saying they're going to keep on reducing their holdings of Treasury securities and agency debt and agency mortgage-backed securities. So they're telling us that QT is not over. And last cycle, we know that ETH Bitcoin did not bottom until QT was over. Right? So for me, I don't even know how to reconcile that, right? Do I just say, okay, just wait until then, right? Wait until QE. The problem is the next Fed meeting's not till November. Is it possible that ETH Bitcoin just bleeds until November? Is that a possibility? I'll tell you what I think is likely going to happen. Okay, this is what I think is going to happen. I think at some point soon, ETH Bitcoin will bounce. And I don't know when, so don't be like, oh, when. I don't know exactly when, but sometime in the next few weeks, it'll probably bounce to the bull market support band. Okay? That is what I think is going to happen. That it's at some point in the next few weeks, it'll bounce to the 20-week SMA. But I think it will be rejected on the first approach. Okay? Just like it was rejected on the first approach in 2016, right here. And just like it was rejected in 2019 on the first approach right there. And then what I think will happen is I think it'll come back down in November, December, and form either a higher low like 2016, a double bottom like 2019, or it could be a lower low, right? If ETH Bitcoin just wants to match what it did last cycle, where it bottoms when QE actually resumes, right? But while that may be the case, I think you could argue that even if it does put in a lower low in Q4, it's probably not worth watching the current devaluation below 0.04 come and go without taking any action, right? So there's that. And I struggle with this, honestly, because I want things to line up, right? I want it to make sense. And I'm like, the markets are never going to make perfect sense. But I look at it and I'm like, how can this be? How can it be all Bitcoin pairs are still at 0.38? It looks like they're getting rejected by the bull market support band. It looks like they're getting rejected by what was previously support. But they still haven't taken that turn down. And last cycle, they took that turn down before ETH did. So it's difficult, right? It's difficult to make this call definitively, knowing that all Bitcoin pairs have not yet made that move. There's part of me that also wonders, how do I reconcile this with Bitcoin dominance? Bitcoin dominance is still not at 60%, right? It's not. But how does it top at 60% if alt Bitcoin pairs haven't even made their way to the range lows yet when it's already at 58.5. One way that it could happen is that ETH Bitcoin bounces and then alt Bitcoin pairs go down. Because over the last several months, we've seen ETH Bitcoin go down and alt Bitcoin pairs have done okay. What if we reverse it? What if we get to a point where ETH Bitcoin bounces, but then alt Bitcoin pairs show weakness? Sort of the reverse of what we've seen over the last few months, or at least show more weakness. And that could be a way that dominance still goes up, but it doesn't go to like, a much higher than 60%. It's because, there's different assets are bottoming out against Bitcoin at different times, right? So there's that aspect of it to remember as well. Now, there's another thing to think about with regards to ETH Bitcoin. And that is this pattern that, and I've talked about this a lot, right? That if you look at the 2019 move, you had a top in January, a top in February, and a top in May. Same thing here, a top in January, a top in February, and then a top in May. And they were all lower highs. The bounce here before the final May top occurred at 0.024. The bounce here that occurred before the final May top bounced at 0.044. Okay? So 0.024, 0.044. But then in 2019, ETH Bitcoin bottomed out at 0.016. Right now, it's at 0.038. If it follows the fractal to the end, it's possible that it goes down to 0.036. But again, there's no way to know, right? I mean, you could have made the case that, and by the way, what's interesting about 0.036 is that it actually happens to correspond to the 2016 top, right? The 2016 top is at actually 0.036. But again, I'm not asking you to take that to the bank, because there are times where people wait for things like that to happen and then it never happens. For instance, with Bitcoin, I think a lot of people were waiting to buy Bitcoin once it hit the 2019 high, and it never hit it, right? It got close, but then it never actually hit it. So you have to be careful. You have to be careful about assuming something has to play out in a very specific way or bottom at a very specific level. It makes sense to hedge your bets, right? So for me, what I would say is this. This is my own opinion. I don't know how low it's going to go. I don't. I wish I could tell you. But I will say this. I think that ETH Bitcoin is in the process of carving out a bottom. Whatever that bottom looks like, I don't know exactly, but I think it's in the process of carving it out over the next, before the end of the year, right? Before the end of the year. In a year from now, I don't really think you're going to care if it's 0.038 or 0.036 back then, right? It's probably not going to really matter, right? But that is my view. Now, there's something else we have to talk about, right? And there's this idea that I think a lot of people have where I talk about ETH Bitcoin and I say like, all right, well, I think ETH Bitcoin is in the process of carving out a bottom, right? And then some people are like, oh, well, that means he's bullish on ETHUSD. And there is some truth to the idea that whenever ETH Bitcoin bottoms, ETHUSD will likely, have a nice little rally, right? It's possible. But you have to remember that in 2019, ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September, which is the same month, right? And we're in September now of 2019. It bottomed in September, a double bottom in December. But the issue, right? The issue with this is that while ETH Bitcoin bottomed here, while it did technically bottom, ETHUSD continued to go down, right? And this is the trick, and I've honestly dreaded this part, and I was actually kind of hoping that ETH Bitcoin capitulated in December as opposed to September, because I felt like that would make it a little bit more simplistic. Like in 2016, ETH Bitcoin just bottomed out in December when ETHUSD bottomed, right? And it made it easy because then you could just be bullish on both ETH Bitcoin and ETHUSD, and it was the same. But in 2019, when ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September, ETHUSD still went down in Q4, even though ETH Bitcoin had already bottomed, right? So if you had made the trade from Bitcoin to ETH back in September of 2019, you probably would have felt like a genius because you ended up getting the bottom, right? But if you look at the USD chart, right, if you only look at the USD chart and you say, what was Ethereum doing the week of September 2nd when you would have theoretically made the trade? That is when ETH USD got a rally. You probably felt like a genius because you're like, I timed the bottom. And then a few weeks later, all those gains were given back. And then you watch the market go sideways for 2 months. And then ETH went on to put in a low or a lower low, a lower low, and then another lower low. So you're sitting there thinking to yourself, I waited, I timed the bottom on ETH Bitcoin, therefore all systems go. And while you might have been right about ETH Bitcoin, ETH USD continued to go down in Q4. So there is a difference between ETH Bitcoin and ETH USD, right? There is a difference. And also, I've made this comparison as well. I think that ETH USD is mimicking 2016. It's a weaker version of 2016. It's a combination of 2016 and 2019. And what I said back then, I've said this for months, right? Every single month that was green in 2016 has been green in 2024, and every single month that was red in 2016 has been red in 2024. Just take a look, right? 2016, January, February, March were green. In 2024, January, February, and March were green. And then April was red. April was red here. And then May was green. May was green. And then June, July, and August were red. Same thing, right? June, July, and August were red. And then September ended up being green, which is in the month we're in right now, right? September ended up being green, which is what might actually happen. I mean, the monthly open for Ethereum was 25.12, and it's already at 24.75. Like, it's certainly possible. And last cycle, when the Fed pivoted, ETH USD rallied for a couple weeks, right? And they just pivoted yesterday. So it's certainly possible that ETH USD closes the month green, just like in 2016. But the issue is that ETH USD could still go down in Q4. Just like it did in 2016, which is also when ETH Bitcoin broke down. Some people tell me, stop comparing this cycle to 2019 when this is a halving year. But guys, when you look at ETH Bitcoin, there's only been 2 times in history, other than the previous time, where it broke down. It was in 2016 and 2019, right? 2016 and 2019 are the only 2 times that it's broken down before. And so when I look at ETH USD, I have to make the comparison to both 2016 and 2019. And in 2016, ETH USD went down in Q4 after a green September. And in 2019, ETH USD went down in Q4 after a green September. And back then, it also was green in October too. But in both cases, the quarterly candle for Ethereum in Q4 was red in 2016 and in 2019, right? In both cases, it ended up being red. So you got to be careful, right? I mean, you have to remember that history can sometimes repeat itself, and that it makes sense to be hedged. I do think that, as it relates to ETH Bitcoin, I do think the bottom will occur relatively soon. It's possible it's already in. It's possible it takes a little bit longer if it follows what it did last cycle with QE. But my opinion on it is this. I've done these things before where I will say this is going to happen. It happens. And then I don't make a bold declaration that, all right, it's happened. It's time to move on. For me, I've been waiting for this for years. And while it's possible that ETH Bitcoin might go a little bit lower, maybe 0.036, absolute worst case scenario in my view is 0.03. But I honestly got to be honest. I got to be honest, right? I don't think it's going to go that low, right? I don't think it's going to go to 0.03, but it would be what I would consider to be the worst case scenario, right? It's not my base case, but if you were to say connect these dots, like if you were to connect the dots here and say you have a low and then you have a higher low and higher low, where does it go? It ends up going to about 0.034 or so. But again, I don't know where the exact bottom is. What I will say is that I think the bottom is between 0.03 and 0.04. It could be as high as 0.038, which is where it is right now. It could be as low as 0.03. I would say it's probably not going to go as low as 0.03. But, there's another thing to think about as well, and that's Bitcoin dominance. And, right now, Bitcoin dominance is in a massive uptrend. And what's fascinating is that last cycle, Bitcoin dominance you see these 4 green candles in a row. It's also in 4 green candles in a row. And it was actually the 4th green candle where the Fed cut rates last cycle. And that's where we are right now. The Fed cut rates, Bitcoin dominance is in its 4th green candle. So what that means is if it continues to follow suit, then you get another green candle by Bitcoin dominance in October. And then it could also go higher again in November, but still somehow close the month red. So I still think that Bitcoin dominance is in an uptrend. I don't think that Bitcoin dominance has topped. I don't. I think it will go probably to approximately 60%. So I don't think Bitcoin dominance has topped, which is why ETH Bitcoin could go a little bit lower. But there does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin bottoms before the collective altcoin market bottoms against Bitcoin. Right? Does that make sense? Right? They don't all have to happen at the same time. And I think that's what a lot of people might forget is that some assets will bottom out against Bitcoin well before other assets bottom out against Bitcoin. And all I know right now is that it looks like ETH Bitcoin is in its final stages of capitulation. And I don't know how low it's going to go, but I do believe this represents final capitulation for ETH Bitcoin. And I do think it's going to bottom out relatively soon. Worst case scenario is that it bounces and then puts in a lower low in December. That's like worst case, I think. Like, like if it does something like this where it does what it did in 2019, but then it bounces and then goes a little bit lower in December because QE hasn't returned. Whereas back over here, when it bounced, QE had returned. Again, it's a piece of the puzzle. I'm trying to put it together. I'm just trying to be honest with you guys. I think the most likely outcome is that ETH Bitcoin bottoms relatively soon. And then I think there's a really high chance that ETH USD still shows weakness in Q4. Now, some people assume that means Bitcoin has to be weak in Q4 as well. And I would honestly agree with that assessment if it is to play out like that. But there is some precedence for it to not play out like that. For instance, in Q4 of 2016, Bitcoin USD actually went up while ETH USD went down, right? So here's Bitcoin USD. Bitcoin was going up, ETH Bitcoin was going down, but ETH Bitcoin was going down also while ETH USD was going down. In 2019, when ETH USD was going down in Q4, Bitcoin was also going down. But that's why my conviction on Bitcoin dominance has always been higher than basically everything else, because in my mind, I was confident that no matter what happens in the markets, Bitcoin's going to outperform most everything else. That's why I'll just stay Bitcoin heavy, right? But I think that ETH Bitcoin is going to carve out a bottom between September and December. Okay? There's another thing you can look at to get a little bit of insight into this. Look at the daily time frame for this. Look at the 50-day moving average. I was looking at this earlier. When ETH Bitcoin entered into final capitulation in 2016, once ETH Bitcoin rallied back to the 50-day SMA, the bottom was in, right? Bottom was in. In 2019, once ETH Bitcoin, after it broke the range low, right? That's the important point. It broke the range low, right? Once it rallied back up to the 50-day SMA, the bottom was in. All right? So where are we today? The 50-day SMA right now is currently at 0.043, or it's a little bit below 0.043, right? It's at 0.04287. So I would say this. I don't know when it's going to bottom exactly, but whenever ETH Bitcoin rallies back up and crosses the 50-day SMA, there's a good chance the bottom is in, right? So I would say whenever that happens, whenever you see it cross above the 50-day moving average, a fairly good indication that the bottom is in. Does that make sense? So like right here, right? You see it crossed through the 50-day SMA and the bottom was in. The reason why this might be difficult is when this happened in 2019, Bitcoin was actually dropping. So ETH was going up against Bitcoin, but it was because Bitcoin was dropping faster than Ethereum. And so that's why people might not have cared. But I'm telling you, this is important, especially if you value your portfolio in Satoshis. And look, guys, I put on my Bitcoin Maxi hat 3 years ago, and I don't make any apologies for it. And I told you guys back then this was what was going to happen. And some people believed it and some people didn't. And the people that didn't are now acting like they were on the right side of it. And the people that did believe it, I think, feel fortunate that they stayed the course this long. But those are my views, right? Those are my views. The other thing I feel compelled to say is this. There's been only one hiking cycle, really, that we've experienced for ETH Bitcoin. And it might provide a little more insight into when ETH Bitcoin might bottom, right? So there's one idea, right? There's one idea that ETH Bitcoin bottoms when QE returns, right? That's one idea. But let's suppose for a minute that we don't know, when QE is going to return, right? Let's just suppose, which is true. We don't. But let's just suppose we don't even know that this is a thing, right? Let's just say all we have is the ETH Bitcoin chart and the ETH USD chart, and nothing else matters, right? That's the argument. Nothing else matters. The news cycle doesn't matter. What the Fed's doing doesn't matter. All that matters is ETH Bitcoin and ETH USD as it relates to understanding, investing in Ethereum. And all I want to know is, what does the chart tell me when ETH Bitcoin bottomed last cycle? Forget about QE, forget about interest rates, forget about all that. Assume that it's already reflected in the chart, right? That's the assumption, is that it's already reflected in the chart. So if you think about it like that, you'll come up with a fairly interesting story to tell. Do you guys remember this wedge here? If you connect the dots, and how I talked about how ETH USD will fall back into the wedge when rate cuts arrived? And sure as hell, that's exactly what it did, right? It took a long time, right? I mean, it's not like it was an easy wait. But look at this. Connect the dots. Does it not look like the same thing as last cycle? Just a larger version of it? You see that? How this is where rate cuts occurred back over here. And then this is where they've occurred right here. It's almost uncanny that it's doing the same exact thing. Just a larger version of it. And if you were to overlay, I just said I wasn't going to talk about interest rates. But if you overlay interest rates, you can see that was when the Fed cut, is right when ETH USD was sort of falling below the wedge. And right now you can see that ETH USD is trying to really stay in the wedge, but it's struggling to do so, right? It's struggling to do so. So let's do back what I said and say, let's forget about interest rates for a minute. So on this chart, when did ETH Bitcoin bottom? Right on this chart. Not about interest rates, not about monetary policy and QE, none of that stuff. Get it out of here, right? No one cares. When on this chart did it bottom? Did it bottom while ETH USD was in the wedge? Did it bottom after it? Guess where it bottomed? It bottomed right. So the first rate cut was this weekly candle right here. So that was the first rate cut. Okay? That was the first rate cut. ETH Bitcoin bottomed after the correction following the first rate cut. So ETH Bitcoin bottomed right there. Okay? That's where it bottomed, in September of 2019. So it technically bottomed 5 weeks after the first rate cut, right? 5 weeks. Now, that also corresponded to the beginning of QE, right? 5 weeks later. Now, the next Fed meeting, here I go talking about monetary policy. I said I wasn't going to do it, but next meeting is November 7th, which is about 5 weeks away, right? So you have to wonder, despite the fact that the Fed said they're not even thinking about, policy, they're not even thinking about reducing, or they're not even thinking about stopping runoff. They're going to continue QT. Is there a chance, right? Is there a chance where they stop QT in November? Which would be about 5 weeks later, which would be exactly when ETH Bitcoin bottomed last cycle. The reason I have trouble putting a lot of faith into that is because, as I showed earlier, in 2016 and 2019, ETH Bitcoin bottomed 7 to 8 weeks after it broke the range low, and we're in week 8 right now, right? The counterpoint, of course, is that last cycle, the the wedge that was formed took a lot longer to play out, right? So back over here in the last cycle, this wedge pattern played out over 34 weeks, whereas this cycle, that same wedge pattern played out over 3 times as long, right? I mean, it took about 3 times as long for that same pattern to play out. And so there is an argument that it could take a little bit longer, just like the wedge took a little bit longer to play out. Does that make sense? So what I would say is this. If ETH Bitcoin continues to just slowly grind down, right? If it just slowly grinds down, and it's because, and you're watching ETH USD kind of go down too, like let's say next month, right? Because I mean, we're already going to be over with this month in just a week and a half. And if it falls 2016, then this month will be green for Ethereum. And last cycle, we saw Bitcoin rally for 2 weeks after the first rate cut. That basically gets us to the end of the month already, right? So if it were to play out, right? If it were to play out like that, and ETH Bitcoin does not bottom this week, like let's say we're sitting in October and ETH Bitcoin just keeps on going lower and everyone's wondering what the hell's going on. It could be because it's following this pattern of bottoming out after the initial correction when it falls below the wedge, right? That might be where it bottoms out if it doesn't bottom out, let's say, within the next week or so. The problem, I mean, even back then, though, right? July versus August, right? Or versus September, it wasn't a huge difference, right? I mean, it wasn't a huge difference. I mean, you're talking about, getting ETH at like 0.019 versus 0.016. Do you think any of those people cared 2 years later whether you got it here or here? Absolutely not. But in the short term, it probably was all anyone could think about. It was all I could think about. But I have issues sometimes with this stuff. I tend to focus too much on stuff that no one cares about and too little on things that people actually do care about. That's why I'm trying to say, guys, look, I recognize that my preference is the Bitcoin valuation. That's my preference. But I also recognize that a lot of your guys' preferences is the USD valuation. So I want to be clear. There does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin bottoms out and then you still see ETH USD go down. And that could happen if Bitcoin USD goes down. There also is a scenario where Bitcoin USD goes up in Q4, like in 2016 and in 2020, and Ethereum just simply cannot keep pace with it because typically Bitcoin outperforms a lot of the rest of the market in Q4. Q4 tends to be Bitcoin's quarter to outperform. And in fact, even in years where Bitcoin dominance, right? If you look at Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins, what do I do? Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins. You look at year-to-date ROI in 2024, and you compare it to 2016 and 2020, it looks nothing like those years because the monetary policy was different in 2016 and 2020, right? In 2016 and 2020, Bitcoin dominance was at 15% below its yearly open at this point in the year. But this time, it's 15% above the yearly open. Talk about a swing. This is why people went into the halving year talking what about my views about ETH Bitcoin, because they're like, well, you don't know about the halving year. That's when ETH Bitcoin does well. Where are they now, right? I mean, all I see is ETH Bitcoin's at 0.038, and now they're dunking on ETH when they used to be the ones bull posting about it back at 0.08. So this chart shows that monetary policy is important. And if you're wondering why Bitcoin dominance is still going up, despite the fact that the Fed cut rates, it did the same thing last cycle too. Bitcoin dominance didn't top until about 5 weeks after the first rate cut last cycle, and it also happened to correspond to the introduction of quantitative easing. All of that could happen by November. But it hasn't happened yet, right? We've seen Bitcoin dominance go on and put in a new cycle high. I was wondering if Bitcoin dominance would top in like here, because that's when if you line it up, you can see that dominance topped right there at same time. But I still believed, and I still do, that Bitcoin dominance will go higher because alt Bitcoin pairs, I think, still are going to make that move lower. And so I was wondering if in 2019 the market just kind of got ahead of itself and then it consolidated, and then this time it's more of just a slow grind up where it ultimately reaches higher, but it doesn't get there as quickly. I don't think it's going to go way up here, right? I mean, I think it'll probably top out, sooner than that. But this is a chart you have to at least consider, right? So when I think of ETH Bitcoin, what I think is this. I think a lot of people gave me a hard time about it for the last few years for being bearish, even though I explained my reasoning and I try to be rational about it. I try to be like, look, guys, it's not like this is what I want to happen. This is just what I think's going to happen, right? And then now it has happened. And now I'm telling you what I think's going to happen is I think ETH Bitcoin will carve out a bottom before the end of the year, and then I think it'll go up in 2025. I think that if ETH Bitcoin bounces soon, it still could lead to ETH USD going down in Q4, just like it did in 2016 and 2019, which were also years that ETH Bitcoin broke down. Those are my views. Those have always been my views. I have not changed. The only thing that changes are people's opinions of my views, but those are my views. We'll see, we'll see what happens. I'm going to stick to it. I think ETH Bitcoin bottoms out between 0.03 to 0.04. I think it's going to happen before the end of the year, and I think next year ETH Bitcoin will finally start to go back up. Let's just say this. In the short term, I'm definitely more bullish on ETH Bitcoin than I am on ETH USD, and I still acknowledge that ETH Bitcoin could go a little bit lower before it actually turns around. I think the main issue with ETH USD is that it still has to contend with potentially, what we saw in 2016 and 2019, where Q4 ended up being red, even when people didn't think it was going to be. And people keep saying to me, like, well, how can ETH go down in 2016 and Q4? It's a halving year. Well, I don't know. It went down in Q4 of 2016, and that was a halving year. So why can't it in 2024? Right? It could. It easily could. Especially if it follows either 2016 or 2019. That's why it's a difficult market, right? Because the reason it's difficult is because I'm putting out a video now saying that ETH Bitcoin is likely going to carve out a bottom, and someone's going to probably misinterpret that and think that I'm saying that ETH USD can't go down in Q4, right? Which is where my base case is that ETH USD probably will have some headwinds in Q4. But to be clear, I do think ETH Bitcoin will carve out a bottom before the end of the year. I think ETH USD could go lower in Q4. If ETH USD does not go lower in Q4, then let's hope everyone misunderstood me and thought that I was talking about ETH USD and not ETH Bitcoin. But those are my views. Thank you guys for tuning in. It has been a long journey for ETH Bitcoin, and I think it is finally about to carve out a bottom over the next few weeks. So we'll stay tuned and see what actually happens. I'll see how low it goes. By the way, one more thing. If you take the fib retracement tool from this first peak over there, I've been following this for a long time, right? You can see that it actually topped there, and then it bottomed right there. Another top right around there, and then now it's actually really close to that, that basically the 2016 top, right? That one. It's just the one, right? Because that's where it ultimately was. And I've said worst case scenario, right? Absolutely worst case scenario is it goes all the way down to 0.03, right? Worst case. So I think the main areas that it'll turn around are either here, plus or minus a few percent, or worst case, all the way down here. Which, if it goes all the way down here, that would basically get it back to where it was before it took off. So those are my views. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.